They told you the drug war was being won. They were lying. El Mencho, the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere, the man the United States government put a $10 million bounty on, the man who built the Jalisco New Generation Cartel into something more powerful than most standing armies, is reportedly dead. And here is what the American media is not telling you. His death does not end the violence, it ignites it. This is how power vacuums work. This is how empire collapses, not with peace, but with a feeding frenzy. When the top falls, every faction below it goes to war for the throne. We have seen this in Iraq. We saw it in Libya. And now, right across the southern border of the United States, we are watching it happen again in real time. Mexico is not simply a neighboring country dealing with a crime problem. Mexico is a case study in what happens when late-stage capitalism, institutional corruption, and American drug demand collide without accountability. The cartels are not an anomaly of Mexican culture. They are the logical product of a system that was never designed to serve ordinary people. So before you celebrate a headline, ask yourself the real question. Who benefits when one man dies and 10 more rise in his place? Let's start with the history, because without the history, none of this makes any sense. And I find that most of the coverage you see on American television, the breaking news chyrons, the 5-minute segments between pharmaceutical commercials, strips all of that history away and hands you a headline as if it were an explanation. It is not. A headline is never an explanation. It is a starting point, and if you stop there, you will misunderstand everything that follows. Mexico did not wake up one morning and decide to become a narco state. That is not how any of this happened. What happened in Mexico is what happens in every country where the formal economy fails the majority of its people, where wages are suppressed, where land is consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, where the government becomes an instrument of the wealthy rather than a servant of the population. When that happens, and it has happened repeatedly throughout history on every continent, in every era, people do not simply accept their poverty with quiet dignity. They find other economies, they find other structures of power, and sometimes those structures become extraordinarily dangerous. The roots of cartel power in Mexico go back decades, but they accelerate dramatically in the 1990s with the passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, NAFTA was sold to the American public as a gift to everyone. Cheaper goods, more jobs, a rising tide that would lift all boats on both sides of the border. What it actually did to rural Mexico was catastrophic. It flooded Mexican markets with subsidized American corn, corn that American farmers could produce cheaply because the United States government was paying them to do so. Mexican farmers, small, independent, family-scale farmers who had been growing corn for generations, could not compete. They were wiped out. Millions of people lost their livelihoods almost overnight. The countryside emptied. People moved to cities that did not have enough jobs to absorb them. And some of those people, desperate, without options, without a safety net, ended up working for the only employer in the region that was hiring without restriction and paying above market wages. The cartels were not shy about recruiting from this pool of displaced, angry, economically devastated human beings. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the American political conversation about the cartels almost never includes NAFTA. It almost never includes the role of American agricultural subsidies in destroying the Mexican rural economy. It almost never includes the word structural. It prefers the language of individual evil, the ruthless kingpin, the violent criminal, the savage foreign threat. That language is politically convenient because it requires no self-examination. It places the entire burden of explanation on the moral failures of individual Mexicans rather than on the economic policies that American governments, American corporations, and American financial institutions designed, promoted, and enforced. Now let's talk about Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, because understanding who he actually was, where he came from, how he built what he built, that tells you far more about the current crisis than any report of his death possibly could. El Mencho was not born into power. He was born in Michoacan, in poverty, in exactly the kind of rural Mexican community that NAFTA would later devastate. He was at one point a police officer. Let that land. The man who became the leader of one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations in the history of the Western Hemisphere was at one point a law enforcement officer employed by the Mexican state. He later immigrated to the United States, worked as a farm worker in California, the kind of labor that American agriculture depends upon and American politics consistently dehumanizes, and eventually got involved in drug trafficking, was arrested, served time in a US federal prison, was deported back to Mexico, and then built the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known by its Spanish acronym CJNG, into something that now operates in more than 30 Mexican states and has established trafficking networks across 5 continents. That is not the biography of a simple criminal. That is the biography of a man shaped by institutional failure at every single turn. The failure of the Mexican state to provide economic security, the failure of law enforcement as a path to dignity, the failure of American immigration and labor policy to treat migrant workers as human beings, the failure of the American prison system to do anything other than harden and educate criminal networks. El Mencho passed through every institution that was supposed to prevent exactly what he became, and every single one of those institutions failed, or more precisely, every single one of those institutions functioned exactly as it was designed to function within a capitalist system that does not actually prioritize human welfare, and he came out the other side as a billionaire warlord. The CJNG under El Mencho was different from its predecessors in important ways. The old cartels, the Sinaloa cartel, the Gulf cartel, the older structures that dominated Mexican organized crime for decades, they operated with a certain pragmatism. They corrupted officials. They bribed their way through the system. They preferred negotiation to war when war was avoidable, because war is expensive, war draws attention, and war is bad for business. El Mencho and the CJNG brought a different philosophy. They were willing, almost eager, to use spectacular theatrical violence as a strategic tool. They shot down a military helicopter with a rocket launcher. They deployed armored vehicles in open urban combat against the Mexican army. They issued narco banners, those public messages hung on bridges and buildings that were not just threats, but political statements, arguments, declarations of territorial sovereignty. The CJNG did not simply want to operate in the shadows of the Mexican state. It wanted to challenge the Mexican state directly, to demonstrate to the population that the government could not protect them and that the cartel could not be stopped. This is something that mainstream analysis consistently underestimates. The cartels, at their most powerful, are not criminal enterprises that happen to use violence. They are proto-states. They provide employment. They fund local infrastructure. They enforce their own legal codes within their territories. They extract taxes, what the cartels call piso, from businesses operating in their zones. They recruit, train, and deploy military forces. They conduct foreign policy, in a sense, negotiating arrangements with criminal networks in the United States, Europe, Asia, and South America. When you understand the cartels this way, as failed state phenomena, as the organizational expression of a state that has been hollowed out by corruption and economic mismanagement, the death of any single leader looks very different. You are not killing a criminal. You are decapitating a government, and governments do not simply disappear when their leader falls. So El Mencho is reportedly dead. Let us think carefully about what that actually means and what it does not mean. The Mexican and American governments have been trying to kill or capture El Mencho for the better part of a decade. The DEA placed a $10 million bounty on his head, the largest reward the agency had ever offered for a living cartel figure. Year after year, there were reports of his declining health. kidney disease, complications that required regular dialysis, conditions that made him difficult to move and easy to track. Year after year, Mexican security forces conducted operations against the CJNG's infrastructure. And year after year, the organization not only survived, but expanded. That tells you something important. It tells you that the CJNG's power was never really located in El Mencho himself. It was located in the organization, in the networks, in the corrupted officials at every level of Mexican government and law enforcement who had been placed on the cartel's payroll, in the structural conditions that kept producing new recruits faster than any military operation could eliminate them. The kingpin strategy, the idea that you can dismantle a drug trafficking organization by killing or capturing its leader, has been the dominant framework of American and Mexican drug policy for 30 years. And 30 years of evidence tells us with absolute clarity that it does not work. When the Medellin cartel was destroyed and Pablo Escobar was killed in 1993, Colombian cocaine production did not stop. It reorganized. When the Arellano Felix brothers, who ran the Tijuana cartel, were killed or captured, Tijuana did not become peaceful. It became a battleground for competing successor factions. When the Zetas were decimated, their former territories did not return to normalcy. They became killing fields as other organizations moved in. When Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was finally extradited to the United States in 2017, the Sinaloa cartel, which many analysts had predicted would collapse without him, barely missed a beat. His son, Ovidio Guzman, was arrested in 2023, and the organization continued operating. The pattern is so consistent, so repetitive, so thoroughly documented that you have to ask, and I think it is essential that you ask, why does the kingpin strategy persist? Why does it remain the centerpiece of anti-cartel policy when the evidence against its effectiveness is overwhelming? The answer, I think, takes us into territory that is uncomfortable for a lot of people, but that we have to be willing to go to if we want to understand what is actually happening. The kingpin strategy persists because it is politically productive, even when it is practically ineffective. Killing a cartel leader generates headlines. It generates press conferences. It allows politicians on both sides of the border to demonstrate action, to project strength, to tell their constituents that progress is being made. It is, in a very real sense, a performance of governance rather than governance itself. And in a media environment that rewards the dramatic and the visual, the raid, the capture, the mugshot, the body, performance of governance is often sufficient to maintain political power, even as actual conditions deteriorate. There is something else here that I think deserves serious attention. The American drug market is the single most important structural cause of cartel power in Mexico. Full stop. Without American consumers purchasing cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, heroin, and marijuana in the quantities they do, the cartels would not have the revenue base to build the military and political power they have accumulated. This is not a controversial claim among people who study this seriously. It is elementary economics. The demand side of a market is just as responsible for the market's existence as the supply side. But American drug policy has, for 50 years, focused almost entirely on supply side interdiction, destroying crops, intercepting shipments, killing traffickers, while treating demand as a moral failing rather than a public health problem. Why? Because the demand side of the drug market is located inside the United States, and addressing it seriously requires the American political system to look inward. It requires acknowledging that tens of millions of American citizens are using illegal drugs and asking why. It requires grappling with the opioid epidemic and the pharmaceutical companies that created it. It requires examining the despair and hopelessness that drives addiction in communities that have been economically abandoned. It requires, in other words, a structural analysis of American society. And structural analysis of American society is something that the American political establishment is extraordinarily reluctant to engage in, because that analysis leads inevitably to questions about who benefits from the current arrangement and who is being harmed by it. So instead, we export the problem. We define the drug crisis as a Mexican problem, a foreign problem, a border problem. We build walls, we deploy troops, we put bounties on foreign nationals. We demand that the Mexican government do more, perform better, sacrifice more of its soldiers and police officers in a war that our consumption funds and our policy failures perpetuate. This is not partnership. This is not cooperation between equals. This is a powerful country using a less powerful country as a buffer zone, as an external enforcement arm, as a place to conduct a war that we are unwilling to fight honestly at home. And the Mexican population pays the price for that arrangement in blood. More than 450,000 people have been killed in Mexico's drug-related violence since 2006, when then President Felipe Calderón launched the military campaign against the cartels that is still ongoing in various forms. 450,000 people. That is not a statistic that should pass through your consciousness without stopping. That is more than the number of Americans who died in World War II. It is one of the largest sustained casualties of political violence anywhere in the world in the 21st century. And it receives a fraction of the media attention, a fraction of the political urgency, a fraction of the moral weight that far smaller episodes of violence in other parts of the world receive. Why? Because the victims are Mexican. Because the violence is on the other side of a border that American political culture treats as a barrier between the civilized and the uncivilized, rather than as a line drawn through a shared economic and social space. Now, with El Mencho reportedly gone, the violence is surging, and this should surprise no one who has been paying attention. The CJNG did not become the dominant cartel in Mexico by being peaceful, and it will not navigate a succession crisis peacefully. There are factions within the organization that have been waiting, some of them for years, for exactly this moment. There are rival cartels, the Sinaloa cartel chief among them, that will see El Mencho's death or incapacitation as an opportunity to challenge CJNG territorial control. There are local criminal groups that have been operating under CJNG protection or under CJNG pressure, and who will now have to rapidly recalculate their alliances and their survival strategies. The states most immediately affected are the ones that the CJNG has most aggressively controlled: Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, Veracruz, Guanajuato. Some of these states were already among the most violent in Mexico. Guanajuato, which is one of Mexico's most economically productive states, home to significant manufacturing operations, including a major cluster of automotive industry suppliers, has been experiencing extraordinary levels of homicidal violence for several years. The irony there, and it is an irony that Richard Wolff would want you to notice, is that the economic activity in Guanajuato, the formal manufacturing economy that global capital has invested in, exists in close geographic and social proximity to catastrophic criminal violence. The companies extracting profit from Guanajuato's labor force are doing so in a context of ongoing civil conflict. The workers assembling car parts and consumer electronics in Guanajuato are doing so in communities where cartel violence is a daily reality. This is not incidental. This is a feature of the global economic architecture. Global capital goes where labor is cheap and regulation is thin. Labor is cheap where workers have no power. Workers have no power where governments are weak, corrupted, or actively hostile to labor organization. And governments are weak and corrupted in Mexico as elsewhere, precisely because the economic arrangements that global capital prefers, free trade agreements, deregulation, the shrinking of public investment and social services, systematically undermine state capacity and legitimate economic opportunity for ordinary people. The cartels fill the vacuum that this process creates. They are, in a very real sense, the organizational expression of everything that happens when you strip a society of its economic foundations and its institutional integrity, and then act surprised when people find other ways to survive and accumulate power. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in October 2024 as Mexico's first female president, inherits this crisis in a particularly acute form. Sheinbaum comes from the political tradition of her predecessor, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, whose hugs not bullets strategy, the policy of addressing cartel violence through social investment and poverty reduction rather than military confrontation, was widely criticized as naive and ineffective, particularly as violence continued to rise. But here is the thing about AMLO's analysis that his critics consistently refuse to engage with honestly. He was right about the diagnosis, even if his prescription was insufficient. The cartels are not simply a law enforcement problem, they are a social and economic problem. Military force alone will not solve them. That is not a fringe position. That is the conclusion of most serious academic research on the subject. What Sheinbaum faces now, with the CJNG potentially entering a destabilizing succession crisis, is a situation where military action is inadequate, social investment takes years to show results, and the immediate political pressure is for visible dramatic action. That is an extraordinarily difficult position to govern from, and it is made more difficult by the relationship with the United States, which under the current political moment in Washington is increasingly framing Mexico as a hostile or at least dangerously uncooperative neighbor rather than as a partner in a shared challenge. The Trump administration's designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations earlier in 2025 was presented as a tough, serious response to cartel violence. But let us think about what that designation actually does operationally. It opens legal pathways for the United States to take unilateral military action inside Mexican territory, to conduct drone strikes, special operations raids, intelligence operations without the consent of the Mexican government. It treats Mexico as a theater of war rather than as a sovereign partner. And it does absolutely nothing to address American drug demand, nothing to address the flow of American weapons into Mexico, because the vast majority of the weapons that the cartels use are purchased legally in the United States and smuggled south across the border, which is the inverse of the migration and drug flow that gets all of the political attention, and nothing to address the money laundering infrastructure in American financial institutions that allows cartel revenues to be cleaned and invested in legitimate economies. The weapons flow and the money laundering are particularly important and particularly ignored. Studies have consistently found that the majority of weapons recovered at crime scenes in Mexico were originally purchased in the United States at gun stores, gun shows, through straw purchases. The AR-15s, the 50 caliber rifles, the high capacity handguns that the cartels use to outgun Mexican police and military forces, those guns came from America. They came from an American gun market that is deliberately and aggressively deregulated. And yet, when American politicians talk about the border threat, they talk about things coming north, drugs, migrants, and almost never about the things going south, guns and money. That asymmetry in attention is not accidental. It reflects whose interests are being served by the political framing of this crisis. Meanwhile, the communities that actually live with this violence, the farmers in Michoacan, the small business owners in Jalisco paying piso to CJNG enforcers, the families in Guanajuato who have lost children to recruitment or to crossfire, the journalists who are murdered at rates that make Mexico one of the most dangerous countries in the world for press freedom. Those communities have almost no voice in the American political conversation about Mexico. They are backdrop, they are context, they are occasionally the subject of sympathetic documentary films that American audiences watch and then forget. They are not the protagonists of the story as American media tells it. The protagonist, as always, is America itself, and the stories about what this means for American security, American borders, American politics. That is a moral failure. It is also an analytical failure because you cannot understand this crisis if you keep placing America at the center of it. The center of this crisis is Mexico. It is Mexican people, Mexican communities, Mexican institutions, Mexican history. America is not the center. America is, in many important respects, the cause, or at minimum, a primary cause. And that distinction matters enormously. So, what comes next? With El Mencho gone, with the CJNG facing its first genuine leadership crisis, with the Sinaloa cartel still reeling from its own internal fractures following the dramatic events of 2024, when its own leadership was torn apart by factional conflict, Mexico is entering a period of extraordinary volatility. The honest answer, the answer that is supported by everything we know about how criminal organizations respond to decapitation strikes, is that violence will increase before it decreases, possibly substantially, possibly for years, because the structural conditions that produced El Mencho, that produced the CJNG, that produced 50 years of escalating cartel power in Mexico, none of those structural conditions have changed. The poverty is still there. The inequality is still there. The corrupted institutions are still there. The American drug demand is still there. The American guns are still flowing south. The money is still being laundered. A man died, or reportedly died, and the machine that made him continues to run. That is the story that matters. That is the story that American media will not tell you, because telling it honestly requires a kind of self-examination that is politically and commercially inconvenient. It requires asking what America's role has been and continues to be in creating the conditions for this violence. It requires taking seriously the idea that the problem is not solved by killing the right people or building the right walls. It requires a structural analysis. It requires the kind of long, honest look in the mirror that powerful countries are almost never willing to take. But the people of Mexico do not have the luxury of avoiding that mirror. They live in it every single day. And until the United States is willing to share that reflection, to acknowledge its role in this crisis, and to change its behavior accordingly, the names will change, the faces on the wanted posters will change, and the violence will continue. Because this was never really about El Mencho. It was always about the system that created him. And that system, as of today, is very much still alive.